I think that Arms and Armour is a tremendously evocative subject, and it does work on people's imagination. People have been fascinated by it for untold centuries. It's something about, again, this idea of a bygone age of daring do, I suppose. It's to do with thinking oneself back in history and the stories that one has heard or been told or has read.
This is the classic image of the knight of the Middle Ages, the brave, romantic warrior on a magnificent horse, dressed from head to foot in shining armor, who fought hand to hand in tournaments, battles, and crusades. The era of the knight, in fact, began with chainmail, long before plate armor was invented. The knights fought desperate battles with simple weapons, swords, shields, lances, arrows, and maces. Ours is the whole story of the knights, from their earliest beginnings through the peak of their power to their decline and the legacy they have left us today. As the medieval arms race progressed and weapons became more lethal, the knights and their horses needed greater protection in both battles and tournaments. The story of the knights is the story of their armor, from the simple and functional through highly decorated imitations of fashion, to the almost futuristic and, frankly, fantastical. The story of the knight is the story of a man with a horse. Without the skill of horsemanship or chivalry, one could not become a knight. The story of a knight is the story of honor, and honor was only granted to those who demonstrated their skills with a horse on the battlefield and at the tournament. The story of the knight is the story of heraldry. The more the knight and his horse needed to be protected, the more he covered up. A knight's skills had to be seen and recounted. Recognition on the battlefield led to the development of distinctive coats of arms and the heraldry that is still with us today. In time, rules were introduced, rules of war about how a knight should behave in battle and how prisoners should be treated. During the 13th century, the tournament became a social event. Lethal weapons of war were no longer permitted. The free-for-all or melee was banned by the church, and the much safer individual joust gradually replaced it. These rules led to the idea of a chivalrous code of behavior. Chivalry was reinforced by stories about King Arthur, his Knights of the Round Table, courtly love, and knightly deeds of the past. The life of the knight revolved around castles, and as armor and weapons became more effective, so did the design of castles. They were built to withstand sieges, stone battlements were introduced, and outer defenses were added. The life of a knight was not exactly the life we've seen in books and films.
Medieval warfare was not active. It wasn't knights riding with banners flying into battles, not if they could avoid it. That was only for desperate men. It was sitting outside castles, organizing their blockading and surrender.
Siege warfare played a vital role in military strategy. Sieges were far more numerous than pitched battles. Catapults were used throughout the early Middle Ages. When diplomacy had failed, the siege machine was brought into play. Brutally, the severed heads of enemy soldiers were even thrown over the walls to demoralize the defenders of the castle. In the end, the castle would be stormed and its inhabitants put to the sword.
Deeds of unspeakable brutality were carried out in the name of knighthood and in the name of Christian civilization. In particular, of course, at times like the Crusades, where the infidel, someone who's not a Christian, was regarded as subhuman and ripe for acts of unspeakable brutality.
The life of a knight was not that of a gentleman. It wasn't all glory and romance.
Knights were employees in the Middle Ages, or at least in the early Middle Ages. They were people who lived, at least the professional knights, were people who lived off the goodness of a greater man. There were no contracts. It was a very unstable sort of existence.
The age of the knight lasted for about 500 years. When we think of knights in shining armor, we are in fact thinking about the knights at the end rather than the beginning of their era. The early knights at the Battle of Hastings in 1066 did not wear plate armor. They wore chainmail, a helmet with a nose guard, and carried a sword and shield. In the 13th century, the mail covered the whole body. The knight's head was completely covered with a helmet. He was armed with a lance as well as with a sword. By the 14th century, the helmet had a visor. The knight still wore some mail, but wore plate on his body, his arms, his legs, and his feet. 100 years later, the knight dressed in plate armor from head to toe. He no longer needed a shield. This was the knight in shining armor.
The whole idea of a knight and his armor was to survive a battle. That's the purpose of armor. It's defensive, and to enable you to fight in the very thickest of battles and be relatively protected.
As weaponry increased and became more lethal, so the knight needed more protection. The story of the knight is the story of the development of armor. Our tale begins with an extraordinary piece of work that still exists. The Bayeux Tapestry was created in about 1070, and it tells of the victory of William, Duke of Normandy, over King Harold of England at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Harold had no knights. Instead, he had an army of foot soldiers clad in chainmail and armed with axes and swords. William's army had bowmen, spearmen, and mounted knights. The battle was one of the great turning points in English history. Historians claim it was also the final proof that knights were invincible. Not so, but it suited knights everywhere to believe in their power.
Well, in truth, we don't know where many medieval battlefields were, but we're very lucky at what's known as the Battle of Hastings, in the town now called Battle, to be able to identify what a medieval battlefield looked like. It's about the size of several football pitches, really. It's really quite small, quite intimate. The furthest range of the weaponry, perhaps a couple of 100 yards for the archers.
The Norman army was made up of bowmen, archers, and knightly cavalry. They swiftly advanced across the marshland to attack Harold's English army of foot soldiers, who were lined up on a ridge protected by woods. The battle lasted from dawn until dusk, a series of assaults and regroupings.
In this particular battle, we can guess there were about 6,000 on each side. That seems to be a reasonable guess, which is actually fairly small when you consider that, the fate of kingdoms depended on this particular action.
William's knights were trained to fight other mounted knights. They had developed a new battle tactic in northern France, the heavy cavalry charge. Steadied by their stirrups and safely balanced on a high bow saddle, they tucked their lances under their arms and charged headlong at the enemy. It was this technique of using the couched lance that was to affect the nature of cavalry warfare for centuries to come. At Hastings, the English foot soldiers fended off the Norman charges for the best part of the day, although the assaults at first had little effect upon the English with their great axes. It was the wearing down of the English line in the late afternoon that enabled the Normans to hack down their enemy, including the English king himself.
Certainly, the death of Harold was crucial to William's victory. He had to break the English line. It had been hanging on all day, and with their leader down, there wasn't anything for the English to go on fighting for.
The tapestry shows the death of Harold. We see a figure with an arrow in his eye, and next to it a figure falling with a blow to his thigh from a knight's sword. It is thought that they are both the same man, that Harold was wounded and then struck down.
The Battle of Hastings was crucial because the king was killed. It enabled William to have himself crowned and become the legitimate ruler. The conquest of England, in fact, took about another 5 years to complete, but without the decisive battle on the day, it would all have been a lot more difficult, and indeed William may not have achieved his aim.
The Battle of Hastings in 1066 is the beginning of our story, the Age of the Knights. When we think of tournaments, we think of the joust, two mounted knights who charged each other with splintering lances and a safety barrier between them. It was a sporting event, a friendly contest, but its origins were very different. In the 11th and 12th centuries, it was battle practice for knights with real weapons and no safety precautions. Tournaments were fought over miles of countryside, often village against village. Men were injured and killed. Lives, reputations, honor, and fortunes were won and lost.
The tournament, in its origins, provided battle training. It was not so much mock warfare as real warfare, the kind of skills and techniques that were needed in mounted warfare.
The early tournament was a mass free-for-all. There were no rules. Groups of knights would set upon lone riders or attack unhorsed opponents. Chivalrous behavior took second place to winning. Losing could not only cost the knight his reputation, it could cost him a large ransom, his horses, or even his life.
This is something, of course, that princes and kings are increasingly concerned about. They don't want to lose men and horses in these mock battles when they could use those men and horses in real warfare.
Around the beginning of the 13th century, repeated attempts were made to bring tournaments under control. The church tried to ban them and to refuse Christian burial to any man killed on the field. Despite the increasing death toll and injuries, the knights continued the tournaments. They traveled to France to pursue their sport. King Richard I of England in 1194 attempted to face reality. He also needed to raise money to finance his military campaigns. So he introduced a licensing system. Tournaments were to take place at certain times and only in certain places. He issued licenses for 5 sites in England. Knights had to pay fees to take part, and foreign knights were banned altogether. Safety measures were gradually brought in. The free-for-all was eventually replaced by individual combat, which in the end was to become the joust. Arms of peace or courtesy, specifically designed for the tournament, were introduced during the 13th century. As the tournaments became safer, they changed. They became spectator sports as well as military exercises. During the 13th and 14th centuries, specialist armor was introduced, arms of peace. Devices to hold the lances were fitted to the breastplates to absorb recoil. Weapons were fitted with coronals, 3-pronged heads to prevent them from going through the visor and distributing the force of impact. By the middle of the 15th century, the tilt barrier came into use. The tilt did not replace open jousting. Open jousting simply continued as another type of competition. Initially, the tilt barrier was a rope hung with cloth, but it was soon found to be inadequate, and the contestants could still collide. Around 1430, a wooden tilt up to 6 feet in height was introduced. The wooden barrier made jousting much safer. The lances had to be held at an angle, which made them much easier to break instead of injuring the opponents. Nonetheless, the point of aim in the joust was the shield, the head, or the throat. During the 13th and 14th centuries, pageantry and play acting increased. People reenacted the battles of King Arthur. Stands, beautifully decorated with the coats of arms of the competitors, were erected for the spectators. The armor itself became much more decorative and specially designed for the tournament, protecting the side exposed to the opponent's lance. Tournament armor weighed twice as much as battle armor. It was designed for safety and appearance. 16th century tilt armor had the helmet screwed to the breastplate to prevent it being forced off on impact. Special shields permanently bolted to the armor were meant to deflect the lances. Armor and equipment for horses also changed. Tournament saddles were designed so the knight could easily and safely slip off his horse, the complete opposite of battle saddles. When falling off, could lead to certain death, so the knight was firmly clasped into his seat. Designs became more and more elaborate. There was even a special breastplate made in Germany with a spring mechanism to make the breastplate burst apart, hurling fragments into the air to distract the opponent. Increasingly, tournaments became prestigious social events attended by large crowds. They would be announced 3 weeks in advance and organized by heralds. Apart from spectators, nobles, knights, and their squires, they would attract traveling bands of paid musicians, entertainers, and minstrels.
Minstrels had a large part to play in tournaments from the earliest period in the 11th and 12th centuries right through to the close of the Middle Ages. And indeed, at this time, minstrels are in the process of blending into heralds who have professional responsibilities at tournaments. One thing minstrels could do, for example, was simply to encourage their master. That was something they were very much expected to do. They might, for example, have played a song earlier that day, but when it came to the tournament, their job was simply to shout out, "Go on, go on."
The tournament produced the profession of the herald. The nobles had to ensure that the event was well organized and the rules of competition were seen to be obeyed.
Much of the music that knights heard was performed by professional minstrels, people whose living was derived from singing or playing an instrument. And these people were often very important to a knight, because if you gave a lot of money to a minstrel, very demonstratively gave him furs, gave him coin, perhaps even gave him a horse, that was often on the understanding that he would go off to another court and tell them how generous you had been. So knights would use minstrels as a kind of publicity network. And of course, it was very much in the minstrels' interests to go to another court and say, well, I've just been at the castle of Altafort, and they gave me 40,000 florins, because then the knight would think to himself, well, I better give him 45,000 if I'm going to be as much praised as this. So minstrels had a place, music had a place, in a kind of economy of honor, in a way of publicizing honor. You could buy good repute, up to a point.
Tournaments became spectacles, grand social occasions with processions and evening banquets. The ladies watched and encouraged their favorite champions, giving them a scarf or a piece of material to wear in their helmets.
There is a very strong social dimension to the tournament at this time. The participation of ladies as spectators is first found in the late 12th century. They spur the knights on. The knights perform their acts of prowess in front of the ladies, often for prizes or favors, tokens and so on, which the ladies give them. So that there is a social aspect there, which is very important.
Heralds in fine costumes would supervise the events. They kept records of the knights and their badges. They began to establish rules about the way such badges or devices could be worn. Rules, for example, about how they could be worn on a shield or a coat. They became the experts about coats of arms, or what we think of today as heraldry. It would take about an hour for a knight and his horse to be fully dressed in plate armor. He would be dressed by his squire, who was a young boy himself training to be a knight. Under the breastplate, he would wear a padded satin-lined tunic. As well as trousers made of strong material, there would be strips of blanket wrapped around his knees to stop the armor from rubbing. His horse would also wear plate armor with special covering for the ears, giving extra protection. Like his rider, the horse was dressed in satin and fabric from mane to tail. The squire would dress his knight from the legs up, with the final touch, once mounted on his horse, being his gauntlets. In the late Middle Ages, many aspects of the training of knights evolved into sports for the tournament and continued until as late as the 18th century. Running the ring was a contest in which the knight, at a gallop, tried to catch a small suspended ring on the end of his lance. The quatrain, used in earlier years to train knights in speed, agility, and horsemanship, also became a competitive sport. Originally, it consisted of a post with a revolving arm on top. To one end of the arm was a shield, and on the other end, a weight. When the shield was struck, the weight swung round, and anyone not fast enough would be hit by a solid blow on the back. The tournament outlasted the military age of the fighting knight. It continued in Europe until the 18th century. Even today, the golden age of the medieval tournament is often recreated, as in the Landshut Festival in southern Germany. But it must be remembered that from the 11th to the 15th century, the tournament was an integral part of the daily life of the fighting knight, with all its deadly risk and all its chance of glory. When we think of knights, we think of castles. This is not a romantic view, neither is it wrong. As in all the best adventure stories, the castle was vital to the knight. His life revolved around the castle and his relationship with his lord. A knight was employed to protect his lord and his castle. Without them, a knight was without a job. Throughout the 11th century, local lords built castles, protected their own areas, and fought their rivals. In return for loyalty, the lords made grants of land to some of the knights who fought for them. It was a chain of loyalty, knights to their lords and lords to the king. Breaking the chain could result in the knight having his land taken away. For the knight, then, loyalty, no matter what, was absolutely vital as the castle to the lord. Lords, you see what the life of the world is worth. When one is dead, one is no longer any more than a bit of earth. Behold all that remains of the best knight who ever lived. In his eulogy, the Archbishop of Canterbury described William Marshall as the best knight that ever lived. Marshall was born in 1145. He was not a wealthy man, yet when he died in 1219, he was regarded as a great tournamenteer and knight whose loyalty to his lord and his king was well rewarded. At the climax of his career, William Marshall was regent for 2 years, ruling the kingdom for the boy king Henry III. Marshall's career as a knight began in 1160, when at the age of 13, he was sent to Tancarville in France for military training.
The Lord of Tancarville, William, the Chamberlain of Normandy, was a great employer of knights, a great warrior in his own regard, a great tournament habitué, and a great friend of other knights. The best sort of education that William Marshall could get if he was to be a soldier, and that seems to be his father's intention, was to send him to Tancarville.
Military training for knights consisted of learning how to fight, learning the techniques of wielding the lance, handling the sword, and developing chevalerie, the ability to handle the horse.
Military training was fairly straightforward. It's not an athlete's training. That wasn't what you're after. You're after skills. The skill of handling the sword, the skill of handling the lance, but most important of all, chevalerie, which was the skill of handling a horse, which is the most difficult skill. And the thing that made the knight so desirable, handling a horse in battle with noise, screams, the sound of weapons, arrows flittering all around you, you really needed to be able to handle a horse, and that horse had to be a very special horse.
They learnt to ride at a very early age, almost as soon as they could walk, and they'd be trained when they were being squires, when they were serving as squires, to ride and they had to learn how to move their horse in battle. I suppose the survival of this particular technique is what we'd see in modern dressage, where you can get a horse to move sideways and backwards, and all the steps as well come from battle techniques for maneuvering the animal.
Chevalerie, or the skill of horsemanship, gave birth to the knight's code of behavior that we know as chivalry. Chivalry meant honor, which was only bestowed on those who demonstrated skills on the battlefield or at the tournament.
William Marshall was laid off fairly early in his career. He started his career in 1166 as a knight, and he was unemployed in 1168. Then he made a quick, panicky dash across the channel and found an uncle who would employ him, who went promptly off to Poitou and got killed. And so once again, he was on the streets. I mean, you were literally on the streets too. An unemployed knight was in a desperate state unless he was a man who could demonstrate his skill, which is why the tournaments were so important. They were in many ways not merely military games, but also a marketplace where you could show off your skills to employers. And that's where William Marshall made his reputation. That's where, whenever he was unemployed, he would go.
The Normans introduced chivalry and knighthood to England. They also initiated one of the largest castle-building programs throughout Britain.
In 1066, William the Conqueror crossed the sea and took the kingdom of England at a single stroke. He could do this because it was united under its Saxon kings. But by contrast, Wales was not. It was fragmented and posed a threat to his newly won Kingdom of England. And so what he did was he installed some of his most powerful, his toughest barons along the borders of Wales in what he called La Marche, an area still known as the Marches today.
In 1189, William Marshall was rewarded for his loyalty to the king. He was allowed to marry into the earldom of Pembroke, and thus acquired the great castle of Chepstow in South Wales.
The Maid of Chepstow, the very last surviving person of the Clare line, was married to a man who was to become perhaps one of the most famous knights in Britain, William Marshall.
Chepstow Castle on the Welsh border with England is one of the classic British castles. It was built within 10 years of 1066. With his marriage to Isabella, William Marshall became a great magnate.
When the Marshal actually achieved his ambition, his life's ambition, of marrying the right woman and securing her inheritance in 1199, it changed his life. Before 1189, he was a man about court, a well-known soldier, a knight. After 1189, he was a transformed person. He was a magnate, he was a baron, a man with great responsibilities. And in a way, this castle is a symbol of it.
Now, William Marshall had to defend his newly won power. On a pilgrimage to Constantinople in the Holy Land, he discovered a new style of castle, more difficult to penetrate than Chepstow.
William Marshall is one of the greatest castle innovators of the beginning of the 13th century. Throughout Britain, throughout the 12th century, virtually all towers were rectangular in form. Rectangular towers are weak. Structurally, corners are weak. They became the focus for attackers. Equally, corners tend to be blind spots in a field of fire. William Marshall visited the Holy Land, and there he saw different ideas in castle building.
The round tower afforded a 360-degree field of fire. It protected the gateway in the new wall with which Marshall had surrounded the Great Hall.
Here we see the great castle innovator of the early 13th century at work, producing and leaving for us today a great little gem of castle evolution.
At the heart of any castle is the Great Hall, the seat of the Lord's power. The hall was the main room where everyone lived. Servants, squires, knights, right up to the nobles, all ate, lived, and slept in this central hall.
Well, we're now inside William Marshall's Hall. And what you see here is what you see in most castles in Britain. It's a bare, grey stone building. Now, this hall probably lost its roof in the 17th century. Well, we're now in the 20th century. 300 years. Now, what I'd like you to do is when you go home, I'd like you to take the roof off your house and leave it off for 300 years. People would then visit your house and say, oh, it must have been horrible living here. It's all dirty, dark, damp and drafty. But that is not what castles were like. Castles were the highest demonstration of wealth and power in the medieval world, and they looked wonderful. The Lord was showing the rest of the world that he was that Lord. And if we look towards the back of this hall over here, we can see blind arcading, 4 nice rolling rounded arches. Look towards the top, and quite clearly you can see reddish brownish plaster with cream checkering on it. The plaster you are looking at there is over 900 years old. It is original to the use of this hall. Now, it survives there simply because it's protected by those arches. But every square inch of this hall is covered with plaster and paint.
We have to imagine the hall like this, rather than as a ruin.
Now, just down the valley here, you come to Tintern Abbey, just a few miles away. And when you go to Tintern Abbey, there's this huge west window. And take anybody there and say to them, did they have glass in this window? And they will say, of course they had that glass with those pretty pictures in it. Now bring them back to the castle and say to them, did the castle have glass in its windows? And they'll say, oh no, they didn't have glass then. Now, if you can have glass in church windows, surely you can have glass in castle windows. And certainly by the late 13th century, all castles had glass in their windows. All walls are plastered, all walls are painted. But today, what do we have? We have a few pieces of a jigsaw puzzle.
The hall was a central social institution for the medieval aristocracy. And it wasn't always a place for feasting and drinking. Far from it. It was a place for career advancement. It was a place for conspiracy. Throughout the Marshal's career, there were always conspiracies against him. It was all a great career performance. You acted a part. Life, I would imagine, for the medieval knight would have been very stressful. More so than perhaps for anybody else, other than perhaps a modern businessman, because you were on show all day long.
William Marshall went from nobody to Regent of England, and the castle was the key. King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table are the stuff of storybooks all over the world. Arthur, his knights, Guinevere, Lancelot, Merlin, Camelot, and Excalibur still hold the same fascination today as they did in the Middle Ages. In the 12th century, the culture of Arthur pervaded the world of knights. Minstrels would come and tell tales about King Arthur. He and his knights were the ideal model, a model of behavior that knights and sovereigns should try to copy. Tournaments reenacting the battles of King Arthur's knights were fought. The events were even called round tables. It was the tales of King Arthur that led to the formation of one of the most important knightly orders in the world, the Order of the Garter. The influence of King Arthur provided a standard of behavior, a code of conduct, and the legacy is still with us.
It is the ultimate ideal court. the importance of Arthur and Camelot is it is the ideal court. You see, the whole of medieval civilization is based on taking models of excellence from the distant past. Christianity, for example, after all, gives you models of excellence from the biblical and Old Testament past. And Arthur gives you models of excellence from the chivalric past. And the whole of chivalric society is profoundly nostalgic. It had once been better. It has fallen off since then. Let us do better. And Arthur was always there as a model of how it had been, as it were, in the first flush and childhood of chivalry.
Even in the 15th and 16th century, it was very popular in tournaments to reenact the battles of King Arthur and to reenact the stories of the Round Table. And they were deliberately harking back to this golden age of chivalry, which probably never existed. But nonetheless, that became such a powerful source of ideas and chivalric attitudes that it carried on right the way up to our own time.
Historians think there was a real Arthur. He was a military leader of the Roman Britons and lived around the end of the 5th century. Tales of his great deeds were repeated and stayed in the minds of those who heard them. There is no mention of a real Guinevere, and there is no evidence that the historical Arthur had anything to do with knights or round tables. These were aspects of the story that were bolted on in the telling centuries later. But the stories provided an ideal model. The Knights of the Round Table were knights who had reached the pinnacle of knightly achievement. The round table at which they sat implied no favoritism. This idea of equality under the sovereign captured the imaginations of Edward I and his grandson, Edward III. It was Edward III who founded a chivalric order on the pattern of Arthur's Round Table. The Order of the Garter's original oath is still used today. You, being chosen to be one of the honorable company of this most noble Order of the Garter, shall promise and swear by the holy evangelists, by you here touched, that wittingly or unwittingly, you shall not break any statute of the said order or any articles in them contained, the same being agreeable and not repugnant to the laws of Almighty God and the laws of this realm, as far forth as to you belongeth and appertaineth. So help you God and his holy word. The Order of the Garter was founded by Edward III to celebrate his victory over the French at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. Based at Windsor Castle, the world's oldest surviving order of chivalry takes its name from the Garter, a 14th century piece of knightly equipment. The order still uses its original French motto, "Honi soit qui mal y pense," shame on him who thinks ill of it. The garter itself was a small leather strap with a buckle which could be formed into a circle, a unifying shape, just like Arthur's Round Table.
Edward III was actually born in Windsor Castle. And so this is where he wanted to create this order of chivalry in this historic castle where the sovereigns have lived since William the Conqueror. And also in this house is the famous Garter screen with all the arms, without exception, of the knights since 1348. The first one, the Black Prince, who was the very first Knight of the Garter ever made by his father, Edward III. And so they go through and you'll see the arms and the names of many famous families, such as Howard and so on.
Since it was formed in the 14th century, the Order of the Garter has chronicled its own history. The oldest accounts are contained in these three books, the Black, Blue, and Red books, as they are known. Together, they record the Order's history from 1348 until 1640.
Here we see King Henry VIII in state in the Garter throne room, surrounded by 25 Knights of the Garter at the time, and the knights included 4 stranger knights, crowned heads of state from other countries, each of them holding an orb and a scepter. Also on the pages, you can see the Knights of the Garter in procession to the chapel on St. George's Day, the 23rd of April. We see the king, in front of him the sword of state being carried, and the Garter Knights in procession. On the top right-hand side, we see the head of the procession reaching the chapel, and on either side are the canons of Windsor.
The order was founded in 1348. It consisted of King Edward III and the Black Prince and 24 subject knights. It's said possibly that they were organised in the old chapel of St. George in their seats in the form for 2 teams for a tournament, with the King captain of one and the Prince of Wales captain of the other. Of course, a lot of them were very young. You know, some tended to be friends of the kings and some tended to be friends of the Black Princes. And some of his friends were aged about 20. And it's rather ironic now that the average age, I read in a newspaper a few weeks ago, is supposed to be 77. So they're not the sprightly young things that they were in the Middle Ages.
A Knight of the Garter's banner and achievements hang in St. George's Chapel, Windsor. The banners were introduced in the middle of the 15th century. In the early days, the achievements were only the helm, mantle, sword, and crest, and they hung above each knight's personal stall. There is a crest on the helmet, a design or device worn in the tournament by the knights so that they could recognize each other. The helmet is placed on a roughly carved wooden head and covered with the scarf the knights traditionally wore around their neck to protect them from the sun. Finally, there is the sword, the symbol of knighthood. On the back of the stall is an enameled plate engraved with the Garter Knights' coats of arms. Over the centuries, the designs of the stall plates have changed. The earliest one in the chapel dates back to 1368 and belonged to Ralph, Lord Bassett of Drayton. And there are other 15th century stall plates also of cutout design. Since then, stall plates have been rectangular in shape and carry the names of illustrious figures from Britain's distant and recent past. Because of the historic connections with France, any knight's name has to be in French, the language of the English medieval court. The history of the knight is the history of armor. Ceremonial armor from the 15th and 16th centuries, gathered together in Vienna's Museum of Art History, none of this armor ever saw a sword wielded in anger, nor probably even a joust. It was for display and great occasions. Mail was the starting point of the knight's real armor, used in earnest in war and peace. It was painstakingly made, link by link, individually riveted together in a close-knit finish. To the knight of the 13th century, it was the basis of his protection against swords, arrows, and lances. A century later, some pieces of plate armor had been added to the basic mail outfit, guarding the legs, hands, and chest. By the late 14th century, it was technically possible to make a complete suit of plate armor, making the shield redundant. A long way from how William Marshall looks on the effigy on his tomb in London's Temple Church, and a great improvement in mobility and safety.
the mail armour of the 11th to 13th century was more restrictive than the later plate, which could be strapped to your limbs, so you became articulated, rather like an insect, and could move freely. Also, it took the weight, instead of hanging on the shoulders, it distributed around the body, so the armour simply was not as cumbersome. The one piece that was difficult was the helmet in all periods, and any opportunity to take that off would be taken by the knight. As the time went on, it got heavier and heavier and was extremely restrictive of vision.
This is an English jousting helmet from about 1415, from which it was impossible to see anything except directly forwards with the head tilted down. A battle helmet from 1400 with a visor and a narrow slit for vision. An Italian helmet from 1510 with breathing holes. Armor was made in the Middle Ages, as it is today, by hand, by beating and shaping iron under intense heat. This will be a helmet made from 3 pieces of hammered out metal.
All these have various French meanings, especially this piece here. We have a section of helm, which is a Salé helm, French design. Put that case hardened, so the boys have beaten from a flat piece of metal. They've beaten it roughly to a 16 gauge thickness to finish up the helm, which is worn on the head. Been polished and finished. Quite a good piece of metal with the visor. So here you've got 1 piece, 2, 3 pieces of metal that's shaped and put together to make a complete helmet. As you can see, it's quite nicely lined and comfortable for the wearer.
This helmet lining was made in 1484 in Innsbruck in Austria, one of the great centers of armor manufacture. Another major center was Milan in Italy, where this 3-part helmet was made about 1490. Many helmets were painted. This rare example was made in Nuremberg in Germany in 1500. The neck and body armor were designed to fit snugly together in this late German helmet with its highly ornate visor and crown. This fine helmet with a removable lining was made in 1511 for the Emperor Maximilian I. By 1550, helmets were being made with interchangeable decorative visors. This one from Germany with an eagle's head was the parade version. Armor was available off the peg from merchants, or of course it could be captured in battle or tournament. It could also be specially made, like these magnificent suits from the collection at the Graz Armory in Austria. At the center, a masterpiece of the armorer's art, made in Innsbruck in the 16th century, completely covered in a decoration of embossed leaves, with a final effect like silver embroidery on black velvet.
Think in terms of the cost of a suit of armour as a status symbol. In modern terms, it's roughly equivalent to that of an executive jet aeroplane. Now, how many of your contemporaries have one of those parked outside, ready for instant use? It's a very, very, very important status symbol. In that sense, the medieval knight is as human as you or I.
Not only the knights were clad in armor, their horses, too, had their own. This ceremonial set was made in Innsbruck in about 1510. There are great myths about knights, that their horses were huge and that the armor itself was so heavy that they had to be winched aboard.
It is nonsense, because if you were exceptionally tall, like Edward I, known as Longshanks, you could literally step onto your mount. And there's the famous story, there's a paragon of chivalric virtue called Marshal Boucicaut, a man who was actually captured at Agincourt. And he was able to leap onto his mount in full armor and even do somersaults on the horse's back because he was fit and he was strong, and the armor was simply not as heavy as it's made out to be.
The knights in this group in the museum in Vienna stand as tall as the horse's head. On the left is Maximilian I's own suit of armor from 1480. Collections of armor, both private and public, all over the world, are a vivid evocation of medieval times, and an education as well.
I think the most important thing about a collection of armour like this one is that it's not dead. It's not something that's divorced from the lives of ordinary men and women. It doesn't exist in isolation. So many people think of a suit of armour as being something only ever worn by a knight in battle, and therefore designed purely for war and killing, which isn't the case at all. A suit of armour is, after all, a set of clothes. It's dress, and therefore it is as subject to fashion and to the changes dictated by fashion as dress is. And consequently, if you walk around a collection like this, you're looking really at someone's wardrobe. In the 15th century, the late 15th century, the fashion for footwear was for long pointed toes. All your leather shoes had long pointed toes, and therefore plate armor shoes had long pointed toes. That was the fashion. Had nothing whatever to do with military necessity. It was purely fashion. A few decades further on, the early 16th century, 1520s, 1530s, fashion had changed. Broad, bare paw toes were in. If you'd walked through the streets of any German or Italian city in long-pointed sabatons, you'd have been laughed off the streets. It was unfashionable. It's purely due to fashion. Look later on, 1570, 1580, the fashion for footwear goes back to a 20th century style of foot, perfectly normal and standard, nothing unusual. But the rest of the body has gone completely berserk because you have the peascod belly and the puffed trunk hose of the Elizabethan era. Again, nothing to do with the defensive qualities of armour, it's purely fashion.
Towards the very end of the Age of Armor, long after its value in warfare had been outgrown, it even reached the stage of directly mimicking clothing made from ordinary materials. Puffed sleeves and tunics and exaggerated codpieces took their place in this collection alongside suits which represent the ultimate in design and color. Other suits were made for parades at Mardi Gras when peasants and burghers could spare the time to organize the celebrations for the nobles, who would wear masks both comical and grotesque. There were even suits for children, who must have grown out of them in a matter of weeks. These are suits of armor made purely for display. They have nothing to do with their original purpose. These early Renaissance suits of German armor show typical bulging curves and decoration of slender fluting. This may have been in line with the fashion of the day, or it may have been for extra strength. Surprisingly, much of the armor wasn't shining silver at all. It was discovered that the black, unpolished armor, rough from the hammer in its forging, gave good protection against rust. It saved a lot of polishing. And even for those rich enough to employ others to do their polishing for them, black, always fashionable, became the color in which to go to battle. But the whole point of armor was the protection it gave in battle. And as time went by and weapons became more accurate and more sophisticated, this proved increasingly difficult to achieve.
This is a cuirass. The lower part of the cuirass, which is the body armour, and it is roughly shaped at the moment. There's much more work to do into it. It's been quenched, it's hardened. To finish up, it's too much metal. To finish up the lower part, you see the tracing the line of the lower part of the breastplate would fit so. The strength in a cuirass is in the waist, with the roping round the arms, round the neck, and round the waist. If we didn't have this roping and these various lines of strength, the cuirass, the body armour, would be able to be bent out of all proportion quite easily with a bit of force. But as it is, as you can see, it's got quite a bit of stability and strength. Fits the body comfortably, has to be made to measure, so that the wearer must feel comfortable. In battle, he must have movement of articulation of all pieces of the armour. He must have movement for fall, whereas if he didn't have this, made to measure, the hip bone could be crushed in a downward plunge. The throat could be lacerated.
Fine-pointed arrows with a needle-like bodkin head could go right through a plate metal breastplate.
The knights at Agincourt were astounded when they found their helmets, the thickest and heaviest parts of their armor, were being pierced by these arrows. The worst effects from an arrow wound would actually be the tearing of the flesh and sort of the trauma of impact, but also extracting it later and the problems of surgery and always a possibility of gangrene. One of the best things to do with an arrow is to push it on through and then break it off, rather than try and cut it out, pull it out backwards. It was conventional to talk about an arrow storm darkening the sky, and if there were thousands of arrows in the air, then it would have done. How effective they were depended on how well protected you were. If you were well protected and you were not at close range, so you were a knight, then you would survive, but unarmored men would be seriously wounded.
There's grisly evidence from a field in Scandinavia of the effects of medieval battle. In July 1361, a force of Danish invaders defeated an army of Swedes on the island of Gotland. Excavation of the mass graves shows chainmail head coverings cut to pieces and skulls pierced by arrowheads.
There was a military surgery developed to deal with battle wounds, and of course these were many. They were caused by arrow wounds, they were crushing wounds caused by the use of heavy maces and axes, and they were piercing wounds caused by lances and swords. And there were little manuals produced on how people should be treated. Of course, how well you got treated really depended how far up the social scale you were. And if you were a nobleman with your own doctor, then your chances of survival were a great deal higher than if you were just an ordinary archer.
These men had no private medical attendants. They were not knights or nobles.
This magnificent armor, the whole idea of charging into war and fighting hand to hand with your opponent, who is usually of the same sort of rank, with the same ideas as yourself. It's a very glorious thing, but it does rather leave on one side what's happening on the rest of the battlefield. All the ordinary soldiers who, for the most part, were not actually armoured from head to toe in gleaming plate armour, but had rather smelly, dirty, padded leather armour, and if they were lucky, helmets stuck on their head. And they were the ones at the nitty-gritty end of the lance and sword. in a way, doing the knight's dirty work for him.
From the grim relics of the European battlefields to the magnificent armor of the ceremonial occasion, these are all part of the story of the knights. Westminster Abbey in the heart of London, the home of one of the great knightly orders, the Order of the Bath. Here are the heraldic emblems of the members of this exclusive order. Each is unique to its owner. Each is personally designed to distinguish its owner from all other knights.
The whole purpose of heraldry originally was to identify people clearly and at a distance in battles and in tournaments. And if the design wasn't simple, then you couldn't see who the hell they were. You know, you'd be looking at it and trying to work out who it was. By that time, you'd have a lance through your chest.
At the Battle of Hastings, before heraldry, William, Duke of Normandy, had to take off his helmet to prove he was still alive.
Well, a number of factors came together to give rise to what we now know as heraldry, and I think it's important to remember that heraldry didn't suddenly just appear. Since the classical times, soldiers, warriors, if you like, have decorated their shields with certain devices, and indeed we see this on the Bayeux Tapestry. The knights there, the Norman knights, on their shields will carry certain devices or designs, but these designs, as far as we know, are random, they're unsystematic, they're seemingly haphazard. But then about 1100, a dramatic change seems to occur. We notice that shield designs become more systematic. It's almost as if they're following guidelines. And we can see this in the example of the Bible of Stephen Harding, which was produced before 1109, probably by English artists, where the shield designs are beginning to look very much like heraldry as we know it. In other words, geometric designs with a certain orderliness about them. And we see this again in the Chronicle of John of Worcester, dating to the 1130s, where again the shield designs have a certain orderliness about them, certain system about them. And we would call this proto-heraldry. And then a few years later, we find actual heraldry appearing. And the way in which we know this is actual heraldry is because we know that these shield designs were being used consistently by the person bearing them. In other words, he would perhaps wear them on one occasion, and he would continue to wear the same arms on another occasion. And also, and this is extremely important, that these arms were handed down unchanged through the family. In other words, they were hereditary. And it's the systematic use of hereditary devices upon the shield which makes these shield designs different from the earlier shield designs we see, for example, on the Bayeux Tapestry.
The College of Arms in London, still on the site it has occupied since 1555, is the headquarters of today's heralds, who are employees of the Queen and are charged with the task of granting coats of arms to those who ask and are qualified to receive them. In the hall of the College of Arms is the cushion used by the Queen at her coronation in 1953. Today's 6 heralds, Lancaster, Chester, Somerset, Windsor, York, and Richmond, are directly descended from the medieval heralds who announced the tournaments and ensured their proper rules and procedures were kept. New coats of arms are granted and designed by one of the heralds and then hand-painted. 5 colors or tinctures are traditionally used: blue, red, black, green, and purple, together with 2 metals, gold and silver, and 2 furs, ermine and vair. Canada is soon to have its own College of Arms, and all heraldic emblems relevant to that country are being prepared for the opening of the new college. The emblems used in heraldry are a mixture of tradition and innovation.
There are traditional emblems which we've used ever since the Middle Ages, dragons, lions, griffins, things like that. We still use traditional things like anchors for the sea and so on, but we do try to introduce new emblems because every coat of arms has to be distinctive, and if you're using the same old emblems, it's very difficult to get a combination that hasn't been used before. So we try and introduce new things. I think I introduced the hypodermic syringe into English heraldry, not for a junkie, but for a chap who was knighted. He was a medical missionary in the Belgian Congo, and he went around squirting stuff into people's backsides to stop them getting poisoned by tsetse flies, and he's also got 2 tsetse flies in his arms. But I just wanted to make the point that a syringe is a perfectly reasonable, you can see what it's supposed to be, whereas sometimes people have included objects that are not recognizable. There was a chap in the last century who invented the boiler flue, Mr. Fox, and he was so proud of his invention that the arms have got a section of corrugated boiler flue in there, and it looks, you know, looking at it now, you wouldn't know what it was. It looks rather like a woodlouse, so that wasn't a very good heraldic charge, as we say, but I think the syringe is a suitable one.
The coat of arms that was granted to Admiral Lord Nelson is not considered a good example of heraldry. But it is not only the famous and fortunate who are eligible.
I think most people, as you say, do assume that you've got to be sort of terribly grand, and we have very eminent people sometimes who say, well, I'm not worthy of a grant of arms, but in fact, anybody who has got, say, a professional diploma or a university degree or commissioned rank in the forces, or they've given money to charity or things of that sort, and they're obviously responsible people who haven't just come out of prison, and they're willing to pay the fee.
Candidates for arms do not even have to be British citizens.
We can help Americans in particular if they can prove and record a legitimate male line descent from an English ancestor, any English ancestor, or any ancestor resident in America prior to independence. In that case, they can have a grant of honorary arms, which to all intents and purposes is exactly the same as an English grant. This is the pedigree of my client, Bill Rayford, of Maryland, who wanted to qualify for an honorary or a grant of honorary arms, which he did by proving and recording his descent from an ancestor living in America prior to independence.
So now Bill Rayford, citizen of the United States of America, has his own personal coat of arms designed by Hubert Cheshire. Hubert Cheshire is also secretary to the Order of the Garter and keeper of the Order's registry. When Sir Edward Heath, former Prime Minister, was appointed by the Queen a member of the Order, it was to the Chester Herald he went to discuss the fact that he had no coat of arms for his stall in St. George's Chapel, Windsor. And here are the arms granted to Sir Edward.
Those are his personal arms, which will never be granted to anybody else. There's a zigzag division of the shield, or it isn't a division, it's what we call a charge, which represents the Royal Artillery tie, which has a zigzag pattern, but it also represents Broadstairs, where he was born. You can see it as Broadstairs. They're not very broad, but the symbolism is there. The green here is for the Heath, because he's called Heath. He also was keen to have purple for heather, so it's a fairly brightly coloured coat of arms, this one. Out of one corner comes sunbursts coming out of a cloud. That represents, firstly, the fact that he took us into Europe, which he was very proud of when he was Prime Minister. And also, it represents morning cloud, because he had several yachts that bore that name. At the bottom, Garter King of Arms has signed it, and this is his seal attached by a blue ribbon, suitable for the Order of the Garter, and his seal, Garter's seal, is impressed in beeswax.
Sir Edward's banner now hangs above his personal stall in the chapel, alongside those of all other living members of the order. A knight was a chevalier, a horseman. He lived by the codes of chivalry. To begin with, the code was loyalty and honor on the battlefield. But over time, chivalrous behavior extended far beyond military life. Chaucer's 14th century portrayal in the Canterbury Tales of a very perfect and noble knight is different to the Black Prince, who lived and fought at the time that Chaucer was writing. The Black Prince was seen as a glamorous public figure defending his country's interest. Chaucer's ideal knight was more of a crusader against unbelievers, not concerned with his personal appearance, either on or off the battlefield. But both Chaucer's knight and the Black Prince represent ideals of chivalry.
One of the remarkable things, I think, about medieval civilization is the importance it gives to love and to music in the idea of the warrior. After all, medieval society isn't the only one to have had a complex notion of what a warrior is. The ancient Greeks had one, the Romans had one, the ancient Japanese had one. But the medieval one is, I think, distinctive for its special emphasis upon, if you like, taste and an appreciation of beauty.
During the 11th and 12th centuries, chivalry, or chevalerie, simply meant a body of knights. Today, chivalry means something different. In the 12th century, there was a growing awareness of what we would call civilized behavior. Literature appeared, telling the tales of King Arthur and setting out 31 laws of courtly love, which stressed the virtues of gallantry and courtesy towards women. The very origin of the word courtesy comes from the French word courtoisie, which means the kind of behavior that people were expected to maintain in the noble courts. By now, young knights not only learned songs about the honor of serving ladies, but they also took part in debates with them about the rules of love. This courtly love was a kind of game and encouraged the virtues of valor and gallantry, which helped to soften the hard, warlike image of the knight.
Valor, bravery, is at bottom a warrior quality, of course, but is a matter of taste. It's the taste for what is beautiful and what is excellent and what is superb. And therefore, the impetus that makes a knight behave well on the battlefield and courageously will be a similar impetus to the one that makes him want to dance well, to appear well, to be well thought of. And that, I think, cuts deep to the heart of medieval civilization.
On the battlefield, rules set out how knights ought to behave. Wounded enemy knights must not be left on the field. A knight had to keep his word. If he surrendered, he must not try to escape. A good knight was generous to a defeated enemy. But such rules only applied to knights. Ordinary people and soldiers were outside the code.
An aristocrat was already supposed to be a man of his word. And if he was a captive, he knew what the rules were. The rules were he stayed where he was until his ransom was paid. And he would usually be given a bit of freedom. In fact, he might even be given freedom to go outside the castle, even to go hunting.
William Marshal was a man of his word. He was held a prisoner in France after being wounded in battle in 1167.
When William Marshal was being held captive, it would have been a very uncomfortable time for him. He was wounded, cut rather badly in the thigh. His captors were on the run from the king, and he was taken from castle to castle. When he was in a castle, if he was lucky, he would be kept in a place very much like this. And this sort of room is the sort of room that you would find in castles throughout the ages of the castles, who's ever been built in stone. It's about 7 foot wide. It's got a fireplace. And I suppose for most people, this was comfort in the Middle Ages and privacy too. If you were a knight, you were taken prisoner to be held for a ransom, and your captors expected that that ransom would be paid. If you were a poor knight, you might be in prison for quite a long time, until your relatives managed to scrape together the money somehow. You really did rely on your relatives to do that. William Marshal was very, very lucky indeed. He was as poor a knight as you could possibly find. But he was lucky in that in the brief time that he was serving in his uncle's household, he'd attracted the notice of Queen Eleanor, the wife of King Henry II. And for whatever reason, and some people have suggested quite salacious reasons, Queen Eleanor was taken by him and out of her own pocket paid for his release.
The church was a major force in sanctifying ideas of chivalry, of good against evil, and the faithful against the unfaithful. For a knight in the early Middle Ages, the ultimate honor was to take part in the Holy Crusades against the infidels.
In the Middle Ages, religion was very much a part of daily life. The knight was expected to protect the church, not simply by going on crusade, that is, fighting the enemies of the Christian faith in the Holy Land, but also to accept and perform obligations to the church in his daily life.
The First Crusade was launched in 1095. A huge army traveled thousands of miles across Europe, gathering at Constantinople before going on to capture Jerusalem. But the city was soon retaken by the Muslims. The last Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land fell in 1291. The Crusades had failed. A religious order of knights was formed, the Knights Templar. In practice, they were armed monks. They looked after the possessions of crusading knights, and they protected people who went to the Holy Land in the name of Christianity. One base of the Templars was the Temple Church in London. The Templars built up a kind of banking system, supplying exactly the kind of credit and deposit facilities of a modern bank. This gave them enormous power and authority. They controlled the purse strings of the French crown. The idea of a fighting monk was less strange to 12th century ears than it is to ours. Monks themselves were often called Knights of Christ, fighting Christ's cause and praying for the lost souls of the non-Christian world. By the beginning of the 14th century, the French king, deeply in debt, could no longer tolerate the power of the Templars, and in 1308, some of their most important members were locked up in the castle of Chinon in France.
By 1308, they had become extremely rich, had become, in effect, bankers to the French crown, and the King of France wanted their money. He ordered the arrest of the Templars, and they were arrested and locked up in a series of castles and prisons throughout France. In this room, something like a dozen of the most important members of the order, including the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, were held. On the walls of the room, there are graffiti which were drawn by some of the Templars, showing religious and other scenes, and including their names.
Despite the codes of behavior normally afforded to fighting knights, the Templars, accused of heresy and sodomy, found the code of honor didn't apply to them.
The conditions of imprisonment, of course, were very harsh indeed. They would probably have been chained with manacles to the walls. They couldn't move around very freely, and conditions really were very unpleasant indeed.
After 4 years held in confinement in this cell, the leaders of the Templars were taken out and burnt as heretics. Today, we often think of religion as being something separate from everyday life, but in the 14th century, the two were one and the same. Throughout the Middle Ages, the church played a major role in the life of the knight. The outcome of battles determined which cause was favored by God. Masses were said before every battle to invoke God's support in the struggle ahead. The Black Prince, who died in Westminster in 1376, represents for many people the perfect embodiment of chivalry, knighthood, and piety. Edward, Prince of Wales, son of Edward III, heir to the throne of England, fought in major battles in France when he was only 16, and such was his skill at arms that he was knighted at the same age. When he was still a young man, he was a senior commander of the English army in the great decisive battles of the 100 Years' War at Crécy and Poitiers. He died at the age of only 46 on Trinity Sunday, the day he was born. Like all knights, the Black Prince had followed the chivalrous code of honor.
Rulers and commanders were capable of great gestures of chivalry. And, for example, when King John is captured in the Battle of Poitiers by the Black Prince, he's held in very honorable captivity, and the prince even served at his table, so acted as his servant in the feast celebrating his capture.
On the Black Prince's tomb are his arms of war and his arms of peace. He may well have gotten his nickname from the black armor he wore during his campaigns in France and Spain, or from the black background with white ostrich feathers of the arms he wore in tournaments. The arms he bore in war were the royal arms with a white label denoting he was the son of the king. The rules of knightly war allowed the slaughter of rebellious civilians, and the Black Prince's reputation was unsullied even by an act of dreadful carnage. At the siege of Limoges in 1370, the Black Prince took the town by assault and had most of the population put to the sword because of their refusal to accept his authority. The laws of war sanctioned the massacre because the city had resisted.
Too often we do look at knighthood through rose-tinted spectacles. Looking even at someone very famous and very well known, like the Black Prince, you start reading about his particular campaigns, and you realize that whereas he was a perfect model of chivalry to his noble enemies and his fellow knights, when it came to butchering civilians and behaving with ruthless savagery on the field of battle and off the field of battle, it's an entirely different question.
The Black Prince asked to be buried in Canterbury Cathedral. He died a lingering death, brought about perhaps by dysentery picked up on his campaigns in Spain. He had 5 years to plan the manner of his going. He asked that the canopy over his head bear the image of the Trinity. His achievements were to be placed above his tomb, and he asked that his epitaph be inscribed around the base. Thou who passeth by silently, the place where this body lies, listen to what I tell thee as I speak to thee. Just as thou art, so was I. Thou wilt be just as I am. As long as I was alive, I had no thought for death. On earth I had great riches, which gave me great nobility. Lands, houses, great treasures, fine clothes, horses, silver and gold. But now I am a poor caitiff. I lie deep in the earth. The knights in armor are no longer with us, but their legacy lives on. As warriors, they fell victim to the arms race of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Plate armor gave good protection against cutting weapons. Blows would slide off, and the armor would be made so that the points of weapons could be guided away from vital areas. But great 16-foot two-handed pikes were a real danger to mounted knights who couldn't get close enough on horseback to attack. Gunpowder was in use as early as the 14th century, but it was only in the 16th century that guns became accurate enough to pose a serious hazard. At that point, armor had to be thickened so much it became too heavy to wear.
The introduction of firearms, of gunpowder artillery, of handguns which could actually pick off and kill individual members of the knightly class. These things, of course, are very important. It means that the supremacy of the mounted knight is certainly seriously threatened.
Gunpowder did not bring the use of armor to an abrupt end, nor did it make the heavy cavalry unit redundant. 17th century cavalry armor displayed in the Graz Armory in Austria was tested against bullets before it was sold.
Knightly cavalry, heavy cavalry in the 16th century became less effective as gunpowder weapons, especially handguns, muskets, arquebus, pistols and so on, became more important. But there were other factors as well, the social factors that have to do with the states of modern Europe trying to bring their military more under their charge, so that instead of having knightly warriors, you have officers in your army. And this is a product of social, economic and political change as much as anything.
Later armies had cavalry units, and they fought in earnest right up until the First World War in 1914.
There is a sort of myth of the end of the night, that everything became sort of corrupted and chivalry was devalued and so on, and this was happening in the 15th century. I think it's overplayed. In actual fact, the chivalric organisations were very flexible. When you find, as Malcolm Vail has pointed out, that nobles are adopting coats of arms which include gunpowder artillery, it shows that they were very well aware of how modern technology was working.
Modern battlefield technology may not have undermined some aspects of the legacy of the knights, the chivalric orders, the codes of behavior, the importance of loyalty, the very existence of the cavalry. But accurate, powerful guns did do away with the practical value of plate metal body armor. It simply no longer did the job for which it was invented. Once off the battlefield, armor became purely decorative and ceremonial, and its design flew into the realms of art rather than arms. The household cavalry, preparing for duty in London, is perhaps the final military expression of the Middle Ages. These troops are still on active duty every day of the year.
The knights of the 11th century are with us perhaps in spirit. They're with us in the shape of the ceremonial troops of the household cavalry in England. This idea or ideal of the superiority of the cavalryman, particularly of the heavy cavalryman, the dragoon or the hussar, this is something that I think comes directly from the medieval period.
I think the household cavalry are in the military tradition of the knights, and there will be members, officers serving in it whose families have long traditions which may well go back into the medieval period. And so, yes, I mean, they would certainly see themselves as heir to a knightly and chivalric tradition.
As they ride the streets of London outside the Queen's official home at Buckingham Palace, officers and men of the household cavalry may reflect on the long tradition of their regiment. They can also look back to its more distant origins among the warrior knights, who came ashore with William, Duke of Normandy, in 1066 to take possession of England. And today's cavalry can also look back to the day 811 years ago when William Marshall, acknowledged champion of the field, fought in his last tournament.
In 1183, he went to his last tournament. There may be several reasons for this. But perhaps the most unhappy one for the Marshal was the fact that really he was just getting old and that there was a new generation who were now attending the tournaments. And he had been a great tournamenter. There's no doubt at all, even allowing for the bias of his biography, that he was one of the great sportsmen of his age, world class, the Maradona of the tournament field, and he couldn't do it anymore.
30 years later, William Marshall lay sick on his deathbed. He asked to be buried in the Temple Church in London, home of the Knights Templar. And just before he died, he asked for a song.
The daughters are called in, and they come in, as you can imagine, mourning for their father with tear-stained cheeks and very surprised to be asked to sing, but they do what they can.
The Marshal lived all his active and political life in the courts of greater men until the last 2 years of his life, when he was indeed the greatest man in England. He was the regent of England. Before then, he was at the mercy of the political machinations of the people around him. And that's the true heart of his life, political maneuvering. That was the life of the knight. They depended on other people. And if, like the Marshal, they then became great magnates, which didn't happen to very many of them, but if they did, they were again still at the mercy of a greater person than they were, the king. The Marshal's whole life was about conspiracy, about sucking up to great men, about flattery, about saying the right thing, about never losing his temper. That's the sort of life that a medieval knight really lived.